Tim Boxall, I like very much what Chris Blackhurst said. I mean, emotionally, it's what I've got a lot of other people feel about the British press. It's marvellous, and we all love it. Unfortunately, practice doesn't work comport with our dreams. And however small the problem, isolated the problem is, the self-regulatory system has utterly and completely failed to deal with it. And in fact, it's collaborating with it. And nobody's got any confidence at all that whatever you do with the PCC is going to make the slightest bit of difference. That's why we are where we are, not just because of the way that some journalists are behaving, but because the industry has completely failed to deal with it, and the industry has fought beside itself. I feel the same about the right of reply. That you say you give a right of reply. Most papers don't. Most papers, this is the other problem, treat people who complain like dirt. They fob them up with lawyers, or they refuse to publish stuff, or they legal over words, or they tell people to go to the PCC, which is sensitive. But you know that's true as well as we do, and that's the other reason. The third point I want to make very briefly is I thought you were making a very 20th century, if you don't mind me saying so, to reply, because if you talk only about national newspapers, then newspapers in print. And that is now a declining proportion of the news that people receive, the material which can well produce them or misrepresent them in any way, any other way. You have to have a mechanism now that can cover all media, apart from those regulated by Ofcom, and not just newspapers.
So Angela first, very briefly, Martin, very briefly, and then Christopher, very briefly, having last word, and then back to the floor.
It makes me sad, actually, when I hear the editors of what I would call the respectable press defending the other lot. And it happens all the time. It's as though somehow there is this feeling that if something happens, if anything happens to restrict the freedoms of the News of the World, the Sun, the Mail, that the whole thing will go up in flames. You cannot compare the behaviour of the Guardian, the Independent, and actually I would add the Times, with the behaviour of some of the tabloid press. And to put them all in one bucket, as though they were all the same, just is like walking around blindfold. Over the last 10 years, I have done 2 sets of interviews with ordinary working journalists over a wide range of newspapers. In neither instance was I actually looking for issues to do with ethics. The research interviews were on completely different subjects over a wide range of people, and in almost every case, people told me about instances in which they had been pressurised to write things that they felt ashamed of. In some cases, I've got one, I wish I'd brought the quotes with me, but I will send them to you. One person who said he was working at, I won't name the newspaper, he was asked to do something which he said was utterly shameful. I said, well, what did you do about it? He said, well, I'd only just started working for them, and I knew that I couldn't leave for at least a year. So I put my head down, and I worked really hard, and I planned to get out of there. That journalist finally managed to make it to another journalist, another newspaper, and he said, going to the other, what I would call respectable newspaper, he said, was like finding Jesus. Now, this was not a man who was even Christian, so you can imagine what that meant. And I think we have to be thinking about, they're not all the same. They aren't all the same. I mean, you say people always get a right of reply. I've never mentioned this in public, but in about 1980, when I was pregnant the first time, I happened to be in the office of Spare Rib. And somebody came along and did an interview with all the women in the Spare Rib office. I was one of them. I added to the interview. I said a few things. A couple of days later, a mail in a big tabloid newspaper, an article which said that Angela Phillips does not know who the father of her child is. Now, I wrote to the newspaper. I was actually, not surprisingly, extremely upset. I had a letter back from their lawyers saying we stand by what our journalist says to us. Hello? I was quite young and inexperienced, had no idea what to do, and did nothing. Now, I'm not as young and inexperienced as a lot of people. That's just one instance. And I said, it only came to my mind when you talked about everybody gets the right to reply. They do not. They really do not. And I think that when you say that isn't what Leverson's looking at, what we are saying is it should be what Leverson's looking at. Because if we're talking about ethics, and we're talking about freedom of speech, one of the ways in which we would immediately get people to begin to think more carefully about the fact that the people they're talking about are real human beings, would be if they knew that if they said something that was clearly untrue or completely misleading, that human being would be able to have not a huge long screed, but maybe a couple of hundred words placed underneath their article on the internet, where most people actually do their reading. And that might, just by itself, without any appeal to law or any appeal to anything stronger, be that little kind of tick in the back of the mind of a working journalist. You see, I've trained working journalists. I know how fast people have to think and how fast you have to turn stuff around. So I think what you need is something which actually impacts on everyday behaviour. So that when people are writing, they're thinking, are these real people, and have I said something so awful about them that they're going to be able to have the right to say immediately under my article, what you said wasn't true, this is what actually happened. I think that would change people's behaviour. I think we would have a more responsible press if we gave rights to the people who are traduced. And I do think they need to be limited, and I do think they have to be carefully judged, and I do think it has to be codified, and I do think it has to be organised by some organisation that has the right to back this up. But I think it should be there.
Martin?
That wasn't short, so.
Very short. Actually, the first thing I would like to say is that I think that the independent should be recognised that actually we talk an awful lot about The Guardian. The independent is quite unsung in a way, particularly in the last year. It's exposed an awful lot of stuff around phone hacking. Indeed, actually, I don't think any other papers covered what price privacy files and some of the details around what price privacy files and what went on there. And I think that's important to say. Just two specific things in response, because I think part of the issue here, you talked about the small group indulging in bad behaviour. Part of the issue here, it's very difficult to believe that when we've been told for 5 years it was one rogue reporter. Not just told by the news organisation itself, told by the police, told by the BBC, and then been more and more apparent that it was not one rogue reporter, and therefore to extend that to one rogue newspaper. Again, I think from the public perspective, if nothing else, it's extremely difficult for most people to sort of take it on board and believe it. For the very fact that if it proves that it was one rogue newspaper, I think in many ways it's worth doing, the inquiry worth doing. I don't think it was, but I think that's an important element in it. To cover up is as crucial essentially as what was going on. And in terms of the actual bad behaviour itself, I think I don't know what people, which Epiat was saying, but I think it is worth saying that in addition to phone hacking, just on the specifics of the Leveson and the News of the World, it's about bribing police officers, it's about intimidating politicians, it's about lying to Parliament, it's about blagging, it's about continued covert surveillance, and it's about a repetitive, intrusive intrusion and harassment on a pretty grand scale. So I think one can't simply say that this is about phone hacking and that was really illegal activity and it wasn't dealt with and that's it.
I wasn't where I looked like Jesus. And I don't like to think I'm 20th century. I think 21st century newspaper editor includes, by definition, websites. And as far as I'm concerned, the same standards apply to the independent websites as apply to the independent newspaper. So I refute the allegation on 20th century. I think in response to the idea that we're all being put into a basket, that is actually what's happened. Leveson has put us all into one basket. I've had to give evidence to Leveson. I've never hacked anybody in my life. Alan Rusbridger's had to give evidence to Leveson. Lionel Barber's had to give evidence to Leveson. James Harding's had to give evidence to Leveson. These are not newspapers that hacked. Everything that's just been said now about the blagging, the police, and all that, it did stem from one group. As far as we're aware, I mean, we have spent a lot of time investigating this, and we have yet to find sustained evidence of sustained hacking at other news organisations. We would love to. I'm not, if I can find more evidence of hacking, I'd love to, but I've not yet been able to find it, and neither have my reporters. The one thing I'd really counsel against, moving it on slightly, and this is what really bothers me, when I say I've not hacked, I've not hacked probably because I'm from a generation that when I was on the Sunday Times Insight team and when I was doing investigations for the Independent for Andreas, who's sitting there, it was pre the era of mobile phones. I make no bones about it. If I had to have hacked, I would have hacked. In the same way that David Lee hacked for The Guardian, because I would have been doing it in the public interest. I did lots of things, and other reporters with me did things that were entirely, we thought, in the public interest. But here's the danger. How do you define public interest? Because if you start down this road of taking a hammer to crack a nut, and that's where I fear Leveson is going, frankly, you can kiss goodbye to investigative journalism. You can kiss goodbye to exposés. The fact is, as everybody in this room knows, the Daily Telegraph exposed MP's expenses because of a stolen CD disc. Now, are you saying you don't want that to happen? If you don't want it to happen, okay, we have a very different society. If you do want it to happen, then please come up with a definition that can withstand scrutiny, that on the one hand can allow the Telegraph to behave illegally by paying for a stolen CD disc, and on the other hand, that's allowed, apparently, and on the other hand is going to condemn somebody for pursuing Sienna Miller. Now just get real about this. How are you going to define the difference between what interests the public and what is in the public interest?